welcome back to another episode of Crue Trime. Yep, it's the only time I'm saying it today. My name is Sarah, and what I do here is tell you a terrible story to ruin your day. So sorry. And put on my makeup at the same time. So if that sounds like fun to you, you are in the right place. So make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on the notifications. That way you will never miss one of my terrible stories. They say write what you know, but if what you know is how to your husband, maybe don't write a step-by-step essay titled, exactly that. Because when your spouse ends up and you're just standing there like, who, me? That little blog post might come back to bite you in the orange jumpsuit. This is the story of Nancy Brophy. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna put on my makeup while I do this. I don't talk about the makeup, so if you wanna know what it is that I'm using, look in the description box because everything is linked. And if I'm using something that's sadly not available anymore, I will find you something similar. And I am gonna do my face way out of order today because I'm feeling crazy. It was just before 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday when Portland police got a 911 call from the Oregon Culinary Institute on Southwest Jefferson Street in Portland, Oregon. Inside, they found one of the instructors, 63-year-old chef Daniel Brophy, lying on the floor in one of the kitchen classrooms, dead from 2 gunshot wounds. He had been shot in the back and in the chest at close range. The water at the sink was still running, like the man literally died mid-mise en place. His students were the first one to find him, thinking he was late for class. Turns out he was very much on time, permanently. The scene was as bizarre as it was grim. Dan had come in early like he always did, to prep ingredients, to set up stations for his students. It wasn't immediately evident that he'd been shot. There wasn't like splatters everywhere. There was no ginormous pool of blood. There was no signs of struggle. Nothing had been stolen. This was like not a robbery. What it looked like was a cold, calculated murder in a room full of kitchen knives and stainless steel. The ambulance arrived within 3 minutes of the 911 call, but it was too late. So the police were baffled at first. The classroom didn't have any kind of cameras, no surveillance of any kind, and there were no witnesses to this crime. There was no forced entry. Whoever did this clearly knew exactly what time he arrived at work, what door he used, and they might have had access to a key. The students and the staff members were quickly cleared of suspicion. Nobody had a bad word to say about Dan. He wasn't the kind of guy that had enemies or held grudges or was even confrontational at all. And news of a shooting at the Culinary Institute pretty quickly made it on local broadcasts. So a couple hours later, Nancy, Dan's wife of 20 years, showed up at the scene after the news had broken. And when I say showed up, I mean she parked her car around the corner, asked no questions about what happened, just casually told these officers that she was there because somebody said there was a shooting. She didn't ask who had been shot. She didn't ask, where's her husband? Was he okay? She wasn't emotional. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse in the street in disbelief. She was just composed, quiet. So the police were asking her questions about her morning, her day, what it was like with Dan before he left to go to work, all of these things. And then they finally made this a formal notification to her that they were very confident that the person who had been killed was Dan.
I just want to let you know that we believe it's Dan that's been killed.
Yeah, I kind of got that when everybody gave me the sad sack look. Yeah.
What? Now, to be fair, grief is weird. Some people scream, some people faint, some people order a milkshake, I guess. But Nancy's version of shocked widow felt a little bit more like a Dateline audition tape. So the police are talking to her, and they're kind of looking at each other is she fucking serious? But also, the spouse is always a suspect. Am I right? Then Nancy offered up some very peculiar information. She said that she had been home all morning, but she had no alibi, no proof, just vibes. Well, the police were going to need a little bit more than just vibes. So they started sniffing around. Now, the more they dug in, the more digital breadcrumbs they started to find, and a lot of red flags that were waving villain origin story. But before we get into all that, who was Nancy Brophy? I'm glad you asked. Nancy Crampton was born on June 16th, 1950 in Wichita, Kansas. Nancy was whip smart, imaginative, always scribbling something, poems, short stories, sarcastic letters to the editor. She had a flair for the dramatic and a deep, lifelong love of fiction. She would later say that her influences were fairy tales, soap operas, and old school bodice rippers. Translation, give her a misunderstood rogue, a passionate affair, and a damsel with a knife in her corset, and she was in. So she graduated from high school in the late 1960s during the age of bell-bottoms and burning bras, and then she left Kansas shortly after. Hey, Sarah from the future here. Nancy was not from Wichita, Kansas. She was from Wichita Falls, Texas. I got that mixed up. That's on me. Over the next few decades, she moved around, dabbled in careers of different kinds. She collected student loan debt and eventually found herself firmly planted in Oregon. Now, at some point in the late 80s or early 90s, she enrolled at the Le Cordon Bleu affiliated Western Culinary Institute in Portland. Not really because she wanted to be a chef, but, because she needed a job. And this is where she met Dan Brophy. So Dan was a culinary chef instructor, 10 years younger than her, a bit of a Portland hippie with a passion for sustainability, quiet living, and fungi. Like actual mushrooms. The man loved mushrooms, okay? You say forager, he says life partner. So where Nancy was chatty, dramatic, and verbose, her vocabulary, next level, okay? Dan was more introverted, calm, methodical. Opposites attract. So Nancy and Dan got married on June 15th, 1997 in a quiet, small ceremony. It was her second marriage, his first. And they settled into a modest home in Portland's Southwest Hills. He was a soft-spoken teacher that was loved by his students for his patience, his passion, and his encyclopedic knowledge of food safety protocols.
Chef Dan Brophy. Be prepared.
Dan raised bees, he grew a vegetable garden, he kept chickens. At some point he was brewing his own mead. He was the kind of guy who spent his weekends elbow deep in compost and genuinely loved it. Now, Nancy was more of a sip wine and blog about romance type. Nancy adored storytelling, but she also kind of had a flair for control and keeping a running tally of their bills. So her writing career wasn't bringing home the bacon, if you know what I'm saying. Although she did present herself as a full-time novelist, but her actual income was limited to ebook royalties, odd jobs, and the occasional short story contest. So Nancy took her books to Amazon's self-publishing platform, and she wrote about romance and suspense. I think she called it romantic suspense. The titles of her books included The Wrong Cop, The Wrong Husband, The Wrong Lover, The Wrong Seal, and Navy SEAL, not Kiss from a Rose SEAL. Now, as I said, her books were not flying off the shelves at Barnes & Noble, but she did have a small audience from an online blog that she kept, and that kept her gassed up. So that was enough to feed her ego and, keep her dreams of literary stardom alive. She joined writing workshops, she took part in these romance writer meetups, and she proudly labeled herself full-time author, even when the checks were coming in sometimes. Meanwhile, Dan pulled in about $50,000 a year teaching full-time at OCI, which is not bad, but not exactly yacht money. Now, the couple lived modestly, but they were pretty well in debt. Their mortgage was behind, they had credit card balances, medical expenses, and basically Nancy wanted more. She wanted security, she wanted out of debt, she wanted to feel in control of her life again, and in her mind, the only thing standing between her and a comfortable retirement was this sweet, unassuming mushroom whisperer that she was married to. Well, despite this financial strain, Dan reportedly had no idea about Nancy's deeper resentments. Friends would later say that they seemed happy, or at least content. He worked long hours, but he took such pride in it. He wasn't flashy. He didn't care about wealth. He loved his job. He loved the students. He loved his chickens. And in public, Nancy was the doting wife. On Facebook, she posted cooking tips and inspirational quotes. She shared cute updates about their dogs. She smiled in photos next to Dan at work functions and garden parties. And, from the outside, they were your average Portland couple. Practical, crunchy, harmless. The truth was a little murkier. So back to the police investigation. Dan had arrived for his regular workday at the Oregon Culinary Institute on the morning of June 2nd, 2018. He turned off the alarm at 7:22 a.m. and then set about getting the ice water and coffee ready for the students that were coming in. And while he did that, he was shot in the back as he stood at the sink. Then a second shot was fired directly into his chest. Dan's cell phone, watch, and wallet was left behind, with credit cards and $70 in cash inside, untouched. This was clearly not a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution. So when police asked Nancy where she was that morning, she says she was at home, alone. She was doing laundry, drinking coffee, watching TV, things that don't show up on surveillance footage. But that didn't match what the surveillance footage near the Culinary Institute showed. Nancy's gray Toyota van was seen circling near the crime scene between 6:39 and 7:28 a.m. She was also seen on multiple city traffic cameras driving to and from the area. And the timing of her movements matched the window in which Dan was murdered. Now, when confronted with this information, Nancy told the detectives that she had no memory of going out that morning. Like, at all. She said that maybe she had gone out for a drive to clear her head, but she wasn't really sure.
Okay.
I mean, nothing suspicious about a wife forgetting her early morning drive and happened to drive on past her husband's murder scene. She also later claimed that the trauma from her husband's sudden and tragic death caused a memory blackout. Okay.
Got it. I'll never think about that again.
Now, in the days after Dan's murder, Nancy kept up the act. She attended his candlelight vigil outside with the students and colleagues. She posted about his death on Facebook like she was auditioning for a Hallmark Channel tearjerker. She wrote, "For those of you who are close to me and feel this deserved phone call, you're right. But I'm struggling to make sense of everything right now." Girl, stop it. She told friends that she was devastated, heartbroken, confused, all while calling the life insurance company to see when those policies were going to pay out. And get this, she actually called the police and asked them to write like a memo or some kind of letter that said that she was not a suspect in the murder so that they would release the death benefits. And she's like laughing on this phone call where she's asking for this letter. Like, oh, can you believe that they're asking for this?
Stop it.
Sis was busy, like multitasking widow of the year busy. But the police were squinting. They knew pretty early on that something was off with Nancy. She just wasn't acting normal. So they subpoenaed her internet search history and they traced all of her purchases. Her internet search history included how-to guides about ghost guns, parts for a Glock pistol, and regular visits to a website called ghostgunner.net. I mean, she was a romance, suspense, or whatever she called it, writer, so her search history was probably as wild as mine. I'm just saying. In February of 2018, Just 4 months before Dan's murder, Nancy legally purchased a Glock 17 from a Portland gun show. Now, she did reveal this to the police, and she explained that she and Dan had discussed buying a gun for home protection. But when they got the gun home, they were like icked out by it. They didn't even buy bullets for it. But then, when police later came to search the house, they found a Glock 19 ghost gun kit.
A what now?
But the gun had never been assembled. Then, police found digital evidence of an eBay purchase of like gun parts, the gun slide and barrel for the same kind of gun, a Glock. Apparently, in 2017, so like at least a year before, Nancy had started buying gun pieces, both from eBay and ghostgunner.net. These things are designed for people to build untraceable firearms. Like no serial number, no records. You get what I'm saying? So like bullet casings are kind of like a fingerprint, right? Like you can tell what kind of gun it came from and you can match it literally to one specific gun a lot of times. So when they did that testing, the markings on the spent bullet casings that were found at the scene looked to have come from a Glock pistol. And in Dan's autopsy, his wounds indicated that he had been shot from bullets fired by a Glock. It's all coming together, right? But when the forensics team tested the gun that was provided by Nancy Brophy, the one that she had bought at the gun show, the casings were like the same type, but the markings from the gun didn't match. So this means the gun that killed Dan Brophy was either a different gun or at minimum had a different slide and barrel. Now, Nancy explained that these gun parts in the ghost gun kit, all of this stuff was just research into gun things, for her writing. What it really looked like to police was that Nancy had swapped the slide and barrel of the gun that she had bought with that piece from eBay. It means that she could have followed Dan to work, killed him with that gun, then gone home, cleaned it, switch out the barrel and slide, and it's essentially an entirely different gun. And by the way, that extra slide and barrel, the one that they had the record of her purchasing from eBay, was never found.
That's suspicious.
Nancy said it was just lost. That's not writing research, babes. That's like season 3 Forensic Files rerun stuff. The police also discovered these multiple life insurance policies that we already know about, right? Nancy had applied for or adjusted these in the months leading up to the murder. And then she had started filing claims within mere days of Dan's murder. She also applied for Dan's VA benefits and tried to cash out his 401k. Within a week. I mean, move over, grief. We've got payments to collect. There was also a PDF file saved to her iTunes account that was titled 10 Ways to Cover Up a Murder. They'd also found all of her books and blog posts about murder. She'd been writing about this stuff for years. And then, like an incriminating cherry on top of a sociopath sundae, they found one very specific blog post. It was titled, How to Murder Your Husband. What?
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
This was the 2011 blog post entry. It was published on a site called See Jane Publish, and in it, Nancy laid it out with deadpan precision. The various motivations and methods for spousal homicide, things like money, escape, anger, etc. She even noted that guns were too noisy, but cleaner than knives. But if you must use one, you better make sure you don't get caught. Yeah. Now, she had written this specific blog post 7 years earlier, to be fair. So by August, the case had come together pretty fast. Detectives had a motive, money, a method, the ghost gun, and opportunity. His very predictable schedule. There was also this mountain of circumstantial evidence that all pointed to Nancy. On September 5th, 2018, Nancy Brophy was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. She was taken into custody and booked into the Multnomah County Jail. The arrest was so calm and orderly, you'd think she was being escorted to a book signing. She was also denied bail because prosecutors called her actions cold, calculated, and premeditated. Her defense team said that she was just a grieving wife who happened to write dark fiction. So obviously, Nancy pled not guilty, and her lawyers said she was misunderstood. This was a grieving woman who wrote crime fiction as a creative outlet. Just because she fantasized about murder a lot didn't mean that she committed it. You know, like how watching Grey's Anatomy does not mean that you are qualified to perform surgery.
I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV.
But Nancy had written her own downfall. From the blog post to the ghost gun to her non-alibi, she very obviously believed that she was smarter than the cops, that she was more convincing than prosecutors, and that she was more capable than she actually was. Spoiler alert, she was none of those things. Now all that was left was the trial, and whether a jury would believe that Nancy Brophy was just a harmless novelist, or a premeditating Black Widow. So it took about 4 years for the case to finally get into the courtroom. This was like COVID times, and there was attorney changes, and Nancy presumably needed time to rewrite her alibi in limerick form. No, she didn't. But when the trial finally kicked off on April 4th, 2022, it was immediately clear this wasn't just a murder trial. This was a full-blown crime drama. And it had a juicy back catalog, a smoking gun, literally, and a main character who had already written her own villain arc. In court, Nancy looked like the world's most uncomfortable PTA treasurer. She was calm, composed, and occasionally dabbed her eyes, shocked that anyone could think that she could possibly have killed her beloved Daniel. So, of course, she pled not guilty. Her defense team's strategy was to pretend that Nancy was this loving, loyal wife who was just like the unluckiest person alive. One that happened to write hypothetical essays about murdering her own husband. She just so happened to have made these weird gun purchases, and she just so happened to be driving near the scene at the exact time of the murder with no memory of doing so. But the prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Sean Overstreet, came in ready to rumble. He told the jury that this was not a random killing. This was a cold, calculated, financially motivated murder. In the trial, they didn't talk about that blog post, the how to murder your husband thing, but they didn't need to. Instead, they presented surveillance footage showing Nancy's minivan circling the Culinary Institute in the morning of the murder at the same time that she claimed to be at home in bed. Cell phone data placed her near the scene, despite her claiming that she was at home watching TV and drinking coffee. They showed evidence of these multiple life insurance policies that she had taken out on Daniel and how she so quickly was doing the claims process after his death. The prosecution told the jury that Nancy viewed Dan as more valuable dead than alive. This wasn't just a killing. This was a business decision, and it was one that she made with cold-blooded confidence. And she actually took the stand in her own defense, if you can fucking believe that. We know how well that normally turns out. The prosecution, shredded her. It didn't do her any favors, okay? She was combative, condescending, arrogant. You can tell that she thinks she's smarter than everybody in the room.
Mr. Overstreet, we have had testimony upon testimony upon testimony about the fact Dan was a collector. Dan wasn't a collector by himself. I had my little piles of stuff.
And also that the jury, was in her pocket, and they didn't like her. She was not likable. So the defense was scrambling. They admitted that Nancy had bought the gun parts and the gun, that she was near the scene, that she wrote about these things. The murder essays were ill-advised, but they swore she didn't do it. Their arguments centered around, that her mystery books weren't relevant. It's creative writing, not a murder confession. The ghost gun was never assembled. She handed it over to the police. She had nothing to hide, except the barrel that didn't match, the one that wasn't used in the murder. She had no motive. They said their marriage was strong. They were financially secure. They were planning their retirement together, except she was in debt. She had no real income and was trying to collect Dan's life insurance before he was even cremated. The defense trotted out character witnesses that said that Nancy loved her husband, doted on him, and she wrote steamy novels, not sinister ones. But the prosecution shredded that narrative. They showed the jury a woman who was drowning in debt, frustrated with her stalled writing career, and was increasingly bitter toward a husband who, let's be honest, wasn't the rich, brooding alpha that she constantly was writing about. And the jury didn't like her.
Well, I go off on tangents.
On May 25th, 2022, after 7 weeks of trial and 2 days of deliberation, Nancy Brophy was found guilty of second-degree murder. She showed no emotion when the verdict was read, which tracks because she had been playing it cool since day one, since the day of the murder. On June 13th, 2022, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. She'll be eligible when she's like sometime in her 90s, assuming she lives that long. Her legal team has filed appeals, of course, over things like improper questioning during testimony, but there's been no decision to overturn her conviction. Nancy was remitted to the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Wilsonville, Oregon. Coffee Creek, that sounds delightful. And with that, her storybook life closed its final chapter with 0 fanfare, 0 royalties, and a lifetime to think about why maybe you shouldn't turn your murder fantasy into nonfiction. And that is the story of Nancy Brophy. Okay, again, if you want to know any of the makeup that I used in today's look down in the description box because everything is linked, everything that I can find for you that matches. Also down in the description box is a link to a Google document where you can make a recommendation for a Crue Trime story that you'd like to see here on the channel. You just fill in the form with all the dirty details. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for hanging out today and for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then consider subscribing to this channel before you leave today. I upload new videos here on YouTube every week, and you can follow me on all of the other socials as well. That is it for now. I will catch you. I will catch you next time in the next video. Bye! I haven't done a vlog in like a year. Do you guys want to see one? I have a trip coming up. Could be fun. Let me know. It's a 2-ounce. The prosecution. Oh my god. So it. Amateur villagin. What the fuck is that? What the fuck am I talking about? Like all over the town. Fuck.